Hey guys, today we are in Acts chapter 18. So, yesterday we read as Paul was in Athens in Mars Hill. And today we see in verse 1, he leaves Athens and he goes to Corinth. Now, Corinth is the best way I like to describe it is think of back in the day Las Vegas. It was no holds bar, just anything goes, very hedonistic, very sensual. Nothing was too bad, right? So he goes to this place called Corinth, and this is the letters in your New Testament, First and Second Corinthians. These letters are written to the church that he's about to start right here in chapter 18. And so when he gets there, he finds two Jews who have already become Christians, named Aquila and Priscilla, husband and wife team, right? Um, and he goes and he starts to work with them because they are tent makers. And Paul himself, by trade, is a tent maker. Remember, the SBC hasn't started the annuity board, right? They haven't started the IMB program, right? So missionaries had to work and raise money and buy food and do things that they needed to do. So as Paul stays in Corinth, and he's going to be there a while, he stays with believers and helps them in their business. And that's what he does. And so we can see verse 4, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. Once again, always going to the synagogue first. Then we see in verse 5, Silas and Timothy meet with him in Corinth, right? So remember, they stayed back, pretty much missed all of Athens, but they met him in Corinth. And when they met him, Paul was occupied, of course, teaching and preaching about Christ Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to him, "Your blood be on your own heads." So Paul's teaching in the synagogue, right? So he's preaching to mainly the Jews, but there was Gentiles there. And he preached there for a while. But eventually everybody started to not believe him and started to preach against him and talk about him. And so we see in the Gospels where Jesus says to shake the dust off of your feet, off of your sandals. And so he takes it a step further. He doesn't just kick the dust off of his sandals. He doesn't want one piece of dust sticking to his outer wear, his robe, his cloak. So he just shakes it all off and he says, it's on you, right? He said, from now on, I will go to the Gentiles. So he was in Corinth for a while, tried to reach to the Jews. They didn't want to hear it, or at least the majority of them didn't want to hear it. And so now he goes on to the Gentiles. We see there he meets some people. Verse 8, we have Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. Right? So we even see the ruler of the synagogue, which is kind of like, you think like the chief pastor, right? The chief priest there. He believed in that. But we can also see, even though he's having good moments, verse 9, I think, really brings into context ministry. Even in good moments, there's always bad moments. There's always doubts. Verse 9, and the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent." That's interesting. Why would God tell him, do not be afraid? It's because Paul was afraid. Remember, every city he goes to, he gets ran out of, right? He's been stoned. He's been put in prisons. He's been, people's trying to kill him. And so now he's in Corinth, and basically all the Jews are against him. And so he's kind of kicked off the dust. And so, he's just kind of saying, I'm used to this, right? I kind of know what's going to happen. But God comes to him and says, hey, don't be afraid. Go on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you. We always need that reminder that God is with us, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. Now, either way of whatever your theology is, it's important to know that God knows who's going to believe in him. Whether you believe he elected at the beginning of time or he can see down through time on who's going to choose him. Either way, it doesn't matter. It's your theology, but we can see that because of God's sovereignty and his foreknowledge, he's telling Paul, I have many people here that need to be saved, Paul. Keep preaching, keep teaching, you will be safe. And so what happens? Verse 11, he stayed a year and 6 months teaching the word. He was probably there for a good period of time before that. So he stays a year and a half longer because God told him he needs to. But when Gallio was proconsul, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. So here we go. The Jews are trying to go against him, right? And what do? They do what they do every other city, right? This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to our law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if this were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have a reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, your own religious law, see to it yourself. I refuse to be a judge of these things. Now, this is important because Gallio here, he doesn't weigh into it, right? Today, we would say, well, there's a separation of church and state. Well, that didn't happen, right? Because remember, everybody worships Caesar, right? Caesar is the king, and there is a religion who worships the king, right? And so it's important here, a little interesting fact, in as you read Corinthians, it kind of comes into it a little bit more. But if Gallio would have sided with the Jews here, as they take him basically to court, if he would have ruled here and said, yeah, Paul's in the wrong, he can't teach this. Now, anywhere Paul goes, and they took him to court, they could look back on what we call today case law, right? They would say, well, the judge in Corinth, the proconsul in Corinth ruled on this, so there's already been a ruling. And so they could have easily shut Paul out of many places that he's going to go on the rest of this journey and on the third journey, right? But it doesn't happen that way, right? God's sovereignty, God's knowledge happens. He doesn't. Basically, Gallio comes to his defense and says, hey, this is a religious thing. This isn't a state thing. Keep it to yourself. Figure it out, right? In verse 16, it's interesting. It says, and he drove them from the tribunal, and they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, right? Remember, see, the ruler of the synagogue. But you remember back in verse 8, it says Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue. Well, what's that about? Is there two rulers? No, there's only one. But what happens when the ruler of the synagogue accepts Jesus Christ and his whole family gets baptized and is now a follower of Jesus? That kind of disqualifies him for being a Jew and a ruler of a synagogue, right? So So Crispus kind of gets kicked out of the synagogue, and they put in Sosthenes, right? And so he's the ruler of the synagogue, and they beat him in front of the tribunal, but Gallio paid no attention to this. And so the second in charge that they put becomes a believer too, right? And he gets beat down. And so it's just kind of, I mean, it's not funny, but it kind of is funny, right? So they keep trying to put, the Jewish leadership trying to keep putting these men that will stop this process, but they keep turning to Christ, right? And so it just becomes this kind of exercise that they just keep doing. Verse 18, but after this, Paul stayed many days longer, right? Corinth is the different, right? He wasn't ran out. We see Gallio came to his rescue and said he could teach whatever he wants. And so he didn't have to run out. People wasn't trying to kill him. So he stayed for a long time in Corinth. And then eventually he left, set sail for Syria, but he took with him Priscilla and Aquila. For years now, he has stayed there. and worked with them and got to know them and probably discipled them and ministered them. And they probably are great theologians now of being that close with Paul this whole time. And so he takes them with him. He's going to take them on, right? And we'll see where in just one verse. But I want to explain this because I know some of you are going to have some questions at this. The second part of verse 18, at Krinkahi, that's just the Greek way of saying it. You can call it whatever you want. Basically, it's the port city of Corinth. Okay, at the port city of Corinth, he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow. Now, when you read this, it just seems really weird that you're just like, did he go to the barber shop? Like, why is this one verse about Paul cutting his hair? It was a Jewish custom, not for everybody, but for men who would consecrate themselves, who would devote themselves to God for a period of time. They would take what was called a Nazirite vow. You can read more about that in Numbers, the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, chapter 6. It talks about it, but many men, you have Samson, you have many men John the Baptist, who have taken this vow. In today's term, kind of think of it like Lent, right? They give up certain things. One of them is letting their hair grow, not cutting their hair. They would give up drinking no alcohol, a lot of different things. Okay. But you can read more about it if you want. But what happens is, this was for a period of time. Now, we don't know the period of time that you kind of get to choose, but that period of time is over because Paul cut his hair, right? And so when you're finishing a Nazirite vow, when you're done with that, you have to take your hair that you finally cut and you take it to the priest at the temple in Jerusalem, and you present it to them, and they will do a special ceremony. And you'll do a special things. And it's kind of a full circle of saying, I've given a part of my life to God. And now I fulfilled this duty, right? I fulfilled this vow. And so it's that time. So he cuts his hair. But he's in Corinth. He's not in Judea. He's not in Israel. He's not in Jerusalem. He's in Gentile territory, right? So he cuts his hair. He has to keep his hair, which is kind of weird, right? You're kind of like, why didn't he wait till he gets to Israel? But once again, it was for a certain time. And so he cuts his hair, but he needs to get to Jerusalem, okay? He needs to get to Jerusalem because he needs to go to the temple to fulfill this Nazirite vow that he's taken. So he cuts his hair, and they come to Ephesus. And we'll talk more about Ephesus as we go, but the letter Ephesians is wrote to the church in Ephesus that Paul's going to start there. And he leaves Priscilla and Aquila there, right? So he starts a church, starts some Christians, and remember, Priscilla and Aquila are his friends, but they are probably great theologians. And so some believers kind of started there, and he probably left Priscilla and Aquila to help grow the church and mentor them. And we'll see just in a minute how important that was. He leaves them there, but he goes on to the synagogue and he reasons with the Jews. And they asked him to stay for a longer period. In Ephesus, it was a good ministry. They didn't run him off like other places. And they said, hey, we want you to stay. But he declined. Why did Paul decline? Nobody has ever asked him to stay longer. And here the first Gentile city does. And he leaves. Why? He needed to get to Jerusalem. He had to complete that Nazirite vow. But on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. And he set sail for Ephesus, right? So we kind of, so in Corinth, right? He's there. Bam, they want him to stay. Nope. And he's going to go on, right? When he landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church. Remember, he's already been there. and he went down to Antioch, right? This is his home church. This is the church in which he started his first missionary journey and the second one. Now, you can draw the line right here after verse 22. This is the end of the second missionary journey, okay? Starting in verse 23, we start the beginning of the third missionary journey, okay? So verse 22 is the end of the second. Verse 23 is the beginning. Now, there's some time in between these two verses. Not a lot of time, but there is some time because he had to get to Jerusalem, okay? He had to go down to Jerusalem, probably during a feast. One of the three feasts that they needed to go to. And so then in verse 23, after spending some time there, he departed. And what happens? He goes back to Galatia and Phrygia and strengthening all disciples, all these places that he's already been to, right? So once again, he started in this first missionary journey, did the circle. Second one, he goes back to some places that he's already been to, strengthening his disciples. It's not just about winning souls and leaving them. It's about making disciples. That was the Great Commission, Matthew 28, Acts chapter 1, right? And so the third missionary journey, he starts by going to places that he's already been, strengthening the disciples, building the churches, making them stronger. So while he's while he's doing that, we kind of get verse 24. We get to look back at Ephesus, right? With Priscilla, Aquila, some believers there, but now we come across a new guy, now a Jew named Apollos. He's from Alexandria, right, outside of Egypt, but he has come to Ephesus. And notice what it talks about him, right? He was an eloquent man. He was competent in the scriptures. He was been instructed in the way of the Lord. He was fervent in the spirit. And he spoke and taught accurately about the things concerning Jesus. Notice this, though he only knew of the baptism of John the Baptist. So he knew about Jesus, he preached about Jesus, but he really knew more about John the Baptist. And that speaks to the ministry of John the Baptist that he did, right? But he's speaking and he's preaching and he's doing these things, but he doesn't have quite the full message, right? He's a believer. He knows about this, but he doesn't have the full message. So what happens, right? So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but Priscilla and Aquila, the two tent makers who Paul stayed with in Corinth, and he brought them to Ephesus. He left them there, right, to help build the church. They heard him and they took him aside and they mentored him. They discipled him. Explain to him the way of God more accurately with more detail so he knows the full story. And then he wished to cross. He wished to go back to Corinth, right, and wanted to go on where Paul just came from. The brothers encouraged him, wrote disciples to him. When he arrived, he greatly helped those that had believed, right? He strengthened the disciples that Paul built while he was there in Corinth. And he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing the scriptures that Christ was Jesus. And so you can kind of see this idea of this circle. A little Jeopardy moment here for you. The writer of Hebrews, we don't know who it is. Some say it's Paul. Probably the majority say it's Paul, but there's a lot of talk in who could have wrote Hebrews, right? If you're going to ask me who wrote Hebrews, I'm going to tell you, I don't know. The author is unknown. But there's a big section of people who believe this guy right here, Apollos, wrote Hebrews. I wouldn't go that far, but a lot of smart people do, right? So that's a little Jeopardy moment for you. So right now, I'm going to put on the screen for you the map, right? We did this after the first one, and many of you liked it. So here's the map of the second missionary journey. You can see on your screen to the right? It starts in Antioch, and then he goes up to Tarsus, and you can follow that line, and you can just see where he goes, right? Through Sicilia, through Galatia, into Asia, Macedonia, down to Achaia, then back over to Asia, and then all the way down into Israel, Caesarea, down to Jerusalem, where he would have gave his hair at the temple, to complete his Nazirite vow, and then on up to Antioch. Now, some of these places in this map are not in Acts. And you're kind of like, how do you know he went there? Well, in these letters, right? So when you're reading Acts and you're reading about places, if you were to take the Bible and chronologically place things, a lot of the writings, for example, Galatians, Ephesians, the letters of Corinth, the letters of Thessalonica, all these letters go in between verses of these missionary journeys, right? He goes there, he leaves, and he writes them a letter because he can't immediately get back, right? It's not like he's on a jet plane just flying around. It took a long time to do these traveling, right? And so when he's writing these letters, as we read through Galatians and Ephesians, Corinthians, Thessalonica, Philippians, we're going to get some details of other places that he went to in between on these missionary journeys, right? So it's just kind of the chronological look of it, right? It kind of fills in these maps. And so hopefully if you like this map, you can pause it, you can look at it. I can easily email it to you if you like it or whatever. If you want it, just let me know. But I hope that makes sense as we conclude our Paul's second missionary journey. And now we have began the third missionary journey. And we will see you tomorrow.